Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another session of the Leuven Seminar on Classical German Philosophy. Today, we're pleased to welcome Joanna Raisbeck for a talk on Caroline von Günderrode. But before I introduce Joanna and her respondent, I would like to invite everyone to switch on the cameras. If you can, of course, it's not mandatory, but it's an attempt to recreate an atmosphere of an in-person seminar. So if you can, you are welcome to do so. So today I'm very happy to welcome Joanna Raisbeck, who is Montgomery Fellow in German Literature at the Lincoln College at Oxford University. Joanna's areas of research, the main areas of research is modern German literature with a special focus on early Romanticism. She has published extensively on Novalis, Hölderlin, Günderrode herself, but also on Fichte and Herder. And among her publication, I would like to mention her recent article on Fichte, Fichtes Bestimmung des Menschen und die Rhetorik des Transzendentalismus, published in Rhetorik in 2023, and her monograph, which is more closely related to our topic today, Caroline von Günderrode, Philosophical Romantics, published in Legenda in 2022. The talk Joanna will give today is entitled Spinozism and Schellingian Naturphilosophie in Günderrodes Militi. After Joanna's talk, we'll hear a response by Christine Gjesdal, who is a professor of philosophy at Temple University. Christine's domain of research covers German idealism, phenomenology, and hermeneutics, and she has been working extensively in the last years on women philosophers of the 19th century in Germany. And among her publications, I would like to mention the Oxford Handbook of 19th Century Women Philosopher in the German Tradition that she credited with Dalia Nassar and that has been published last year by Oxford University Press. So the format of the session will be the following. Joanna will give her talk for about 40 minutes. Then we will hear Christine's response for another 10 minutes. Then Joanna will respond or react to Christine's response. And after this, we will open the floor for a Q&A of about 30 minutes. And after the Q&A, we'll leave the Zoom meeting open, the room open for more informal conversation or for other questions regarding the talk without the recording. So you are also invited to stay and to share this moment with us. Okay, thank you both of you, Joanna and Christine, for accepting our invitation. And Joanna, the floor is yours.
Thank you ever so much, Manuel. And I should thank you also for the invitation to speak here. Thank you, Karen, very much for the invitation. I should probably preface this by saying that I am probably something of an interloper here. I am first and foremost, as in my job title, a literary scholar. I dabble in philosophy. And for that reason, I'm really very much looking forward to the questions that you might have, because my approach to Günderrode is very much informed by the fact I'm interested in her as a poet as well as a philosopher. And what I'll be focusing on today is really philosophical aspects of her work. But first, I'll give you a little bit of a brief introduction to those who don't know Günderrode, and then I'll go into Milite further on. So Manuel very kindly mentioned the book that I have on Günderrode. What I'm doing today is essentially repackaging an argument from that book. So I'm very sorry to repeat myself for those who have managed to dip in. So Caroline von Günderrode, for those to whom this author and philosopher was new, lived from 1780 to 1806, very much an autodidact, came from a Frankfurt patrician family, had some degree of education, and we can see that she studied contemporary idealist philosophy relatively extensively. She knew her Kantian philosophy. She read Fichte, and we also had Fichtes Bestimmung des Menschen mentioned there. Günderrode read that too in her family circle, and she developed a particular attraction to Schelling's philosophy of nature from around 1804 onwards, which is where my talk comes in today. And I'm going to be focusing on the third and final collection of Günderrode's. Two of these collections were published in her lifetime. The third and final collection was not. And I'm just going to make a brief literary historical point before coming back into philosophy. What you have before you on the slide is the only copy that we have of Mileti that is in existence. Günderrode didn't live for particularly long. She died at the age of 26. She committed suicide. And the circumstances of her suicide led to the publication of Mileti being suppressed. Everything but one copy of the print sheets was destroyed. But thanks to an individual and lawyer called Johann Friedrich Schlosser, we do have this one copy that's extant. The materiality of this copy is interesting. He managed to have some of the print sheets here in Antiqua, and then he didn't manage to salvage all of them, but he copied out the rest of the text that he had. Mileti is incomplete, but it's also incomplete in an interesting way, as precisely as we can see here. And I'm going to be talking today about a text called Letters Between Two Friends. And the copy of Mileti splits between the printed version and then the handwritten extension to the text in this text itself. I find this completely fascinating from a materiality perspective. It's not so much philosophically interesting, but I think this is a fantastic image. And I'd like to thank the Deutsches Romantikmuseum and Freies Deutsches Hochstift for providing me with this image, which you can see in Frankfurt if you happen to go to the museum there. So Günderrode is an author who's most prominently known in literary history. And she's only just started to be there's only just started to be a reception in academic philosophy. And this is also helped by, as mentioned, Kristin Geesdals and Dalia Nasser's fantastic projects of foregrounding women philosophers in the long 19th century. I should say that my project was very much slightly before what Kristin and Dalia have been doing so fantastically well. So I'm sorry not to be able to engage them with their work extensively here, but I'd just like to highlight this. It's completely serendipitous for me too with the Günderrode project. So part of the impetus then behind my project was trying to think about ways in which we can integrate Caroline von Günderrode's work into the narratives of the philosophical aspects of German Romanticism. She's made predominantly absent from these over the past 30 years, and here I just wanted to put up some of the significant publications in the field. So why has Günderrode remained absent from academic philosophy? This is partly to do with her relatively small yet diverse corpus, but also her status as a non-canonical figure still in literary and philosophical history. I think we can have some arguments about canonization here. In some ways she is, in some ways she's not. What I'd like to do today is to outline Günderrode's philosophical contribution to Romanticism by addressing one of the main threads that runs throughout the entirety of her corpus. I said that she didn't live for very long, but so essentially all her intellectual production is really between 1799 and 1806. And I'd like to claim that there is a red thread that we can find then throughout, from her earlier studies through to this final collection called Mileti. And these are the metaphysical commitments inspired by a reinterpretation of Spinoza that followed the pantheism controversy of the 1780s. In some ways, this really isn't surprising for Romanticism. We do see quite an interesting reception of Spinozism in Jena Romanticism. For example, I have Novalis in the center here and Friedrich Schlegel on the right, for whom Spinozism was a central ingredient to Sympoesie and Symphilosophie. We can see that more specifically in Novalis's Pollen, Friedrich Schlegel's Ideas, and here I have, as the compatriot on the left-hand side, Friedrich Schleiermacher and his speeches on religion. For the Jena circle, Spinozism had a particular resonance and appeal. It was also to do with the figure of Spinoza himself, who mirrored their ideal of the artistic genius. This isn't quite the coloring that we find in Günderrode. What I'd like to suggest, first by talking generally and then going into Mileti itself, that Günderrode charts a qualitatively distinct path from other Romantic writers and philosophers. She adopts a form of Spinozist pantheism, the idea that God and nature are one and the same, as a central metaphysical idea in her work. Indeed, so prevalent are her metaphysical concerns that I'd argue that she is the most consistent adherent to pantheism in Romanticism and in the period more generally. This may seem a rather heavy claim at first, Hölderlin's Hyperion, his novel Hyperion, is clearly indebted, for example, to Platonist, Neoplatonist thought. And he also makes use of the Spinozist slogan Hen kai pan in the penultimate foreword to the novel. Novalis, too, building on what I've already mentioned, makes use of pantheism, albeit rather idiosyncratically, where he's concerned in his draft of Pollen about the question of what makes a legitimate religious mediator. And he uses use of pantheism is humorous, also humorous to the point of almost pathetic irony in his dialogues, marking a jarringly metaphysical and religious turn in a discussion that is otherwise concerned with the explosive and pathological growth of the book market at the end of the 18th century. Neither Novalis nor Hölderlin, and I'll return to those figures at the end of the paper, make consistent use of pantheism as a metaphysical construct in the way that Günderrode does. And why I'd say overall that Hölderlin comes slightly closer than Novalis to Günderrode's metaphysical commitments, the terms of the pantheism controversy are never worked through as thoroughly as they are in Günderrode. I won't be able to go through all of these today in the actual course of the paper itself, but I'm happy to come to this point in the discussion. So why might pantheism prove so important for Günderrode? And here I just like to demarcate her various metaphysical positions. The rough answer for this is that it provides a useful means to ward off problems associated with materialism in the period. And the questions surrounding materialism, when crudely conceived, where matter is inert with no indwelling forces, are to do with how the individual and nature relate to one another. For Günderrode, an entirely materialistic account of the individual is impossible because it eradicates individual autonomy and agency. If the individual is subsumed entirely into causally deterministic nature, then agency becomes conditioned to the extent of becoming entirely determined by external laws. What becomes lost in this process is the individual. Indeed, it is tantamount to the metaphorical death of the individual as a meaningful, independent construct, one that possesses the capacity for self-development and improvement. And this is one of Günderrode's perennial concerns across her work. How can we hold on to the idea of the individual, hold on to the idea of agency, hold on to notions of self-development and improvement, both on an individual level, but also on a both on a social level, but also on a metaphysical level. So what pantheism does for Günderrode, in short, is to provide a way out of the nihilistic potential of a strictly materialistic account of the individual. I'll come on to the question of Schelling in a moment, but it's also worth briefly outlining the shape of Günderrode's Spinocism. I think I should stress here that Spinocism is an important term, since I have no positivistic evidence to suggest that Günderrode actually read Spinoza. We have some notes in her study books, but they're clearly lifted from an anthology which happens to quote Spinoza's Ethics. I don't think she actually read the work in full. So it's best in that sense to situate Günderrode within the reception of pantheistic and spinozistic thinking at the end of the 18th century. And this was very much inflected by ideas lifted from and adapted from Spinoza. The most significant figure here, I've already given the game away with this slide, in Günderrode's adaptation of pantheistic thinking was Johann Gottfried Herder. Herder's vitalized reading or creative misreading of Spinoza in his God-Some Conversations added by way of Leibniz a dynamic element of force to transform Spinoza's God into a vitalist primal force that corresponds with the emergent organic understanding of nature around 1800. Now, we cannot be certain that Günderrode was familiar with God, with God-Some Conversations, but we do have various indirect links to it in Günderrode's study book. And into this, and this would be the third point on this slide, Günderrode copied and adapted Ludwig Koselgarten's translation of an Ode to God by Vanini. Herder had the Latin original included at the end of the first conversation, his God. The Ode is associated with Herder's Spinocism because he portrays Vanini's thought as an antecedent to Spinoza's non-theistic theology. I think there are other textual links that we can make to Herder. Herder's terminology of force, specifically the notion of Urkraft, of primal force, features in Günderrode's work, specifically in the poem The Wanderer's Descent, Des Wanderers Niederfahrt, and Geschichte eines Brahminen, Story of a Brahmin. And there it's used to designate a singular creative generative principle of the universe. We also have the use of the Spinozist motto Hen kai Pan as einst und alles, one and all, in Günderrode's apocalyptisches Fragment, the apocalyptic fragment. These are all earlier texts than the ones I'll be talking about today, but I think it's important to show how there is then this vitalist terminology, this ontology of force that is being referred to throughout Günderrode's work. This Herderian ontology of force is important because it animates and redeems matter with a metaphysical element of spirit. What I would like to suggest is that through adapting Spinoza's pantheism throughout her work, Günderrode is concerned with creating poetic attempts at naturalization, attempts to anchor the individual in the whole that have the effect of inoculating against the dangers of materialism, fatalism, and atheism by transfiguring pantheism into a form of spiritualized materialism. This means that certain cherished concepts such as teleology, individual agency, and self-development can be maintained. And here I'd like to come onto Mileti. This process of naturalization that I'm referring to, poetic attempts at naturalization, but also philosophical attempts of naturalization, these are particularly evident in her third and final collection, Mileti, where pantheism is taken by Günderrode to its logical endpoint, where everything becomes part of the subjectivity of nature. Humans and nature are no longer distinct orders of being as they are prior to this. And this is where Günderrode becomes radically Spinozist and goes far beyond what we can find, for example, in Novalis and Hölderlin, for example. I'll return to this point in a moment. And this is also where Schelling comes into the equation. There are ways in which I could discuss this point in terms of Günderrode's experimentation with poetic speech, and therefore very much from a literary studies perspective. But in the context of the talk today, I would like to focus more on the philosophical content of one of the texts in Mileti. I'll refer to others, but I'll be mostly concerned with her Briefe zweier Freunde, letters between two friends. This is Günderrode's longest philosophical text. It's also her most mature philosophical statement. And those who will have read Günderrode before, particularly translated into English, will have come across this text under a different title as the Idee der Erde, the idea of the earth, which we have in manuscript form, and that is really the draft of Letters Between Two Friends. That's a fascinating text in itself because it's even more Schellingian than the published version that we have in Mileti. So I'd like to return now to the point of Spinozism. There's an important link between Herder and Friedrich Schelling here, because for Günderrode, Herder's reading of Spinoza works quite neatly in conjunction with Schelling's early Naturphilosophie. As I mentioned at the beginning of the paper, Günderrode read her Naturphilosophie very carefully. And this is an important meta-question to answer because of all the idealist philosophers. It was not to Kant or Fichte, but to Schelling that Günderrode felt the greatest affinity, even referring to it as göttliche Philosophie, as divine philosophy, in a letter to the Heidelberg philologist and her married lover, Friedrich Kreutzer. What is fundamental to Günderrode's reception of Schelling's Naturphilosophie and the associated notes that she makes on chemistry, such as the studies of Joseph Franz von Jacquin's works, who was a follower of Lavoisier, are theories of matter. We really can't get away from the concepts of matter in Günderrode. Schelling propounded a theory of matter that moved beyond Newtonian ideas of inert matter upon which forces were extrinsically exerted, according to ideas of extension. Instead, Schelling asserted that matter was animated by opposed forces, polarized potencies, if you will, that form a dialectic in the self-organization of nature. And in doing so, Schelling builds upon Kant's theory of matter from the Metaphysical Foundations of Sciences from 1786, which determined that matter is constituted by the opposing forces of repulsion and attraction. While these theories of the constitution of matter may appear abstruse, and Günderrode's work does without the complexity that we can see present in her studies of Schelling, which include intricate diagrams. I'm very happy to show these diagrams later. These theories of matter are also of broader philosophical significance. They're also of poetic significance too. In the sonnets, The Widows of Malabar, for example, from Mileti, the Malabarischen Witwen, Günderrode interprets the sati practice of Hinduism, or the ritual burning of widows on funeral pyres, as the apotheosis of ritualized and sacrificial love. But this apotheosis of love finds expression in the way that forces in matter operate. Self-immolation and the dissolution of individuals into their constituent elements may build on the Schellingian idea of matter being constituted by opposing forces, but she drops the idea of polarity, which is so important for Schelling. Instead, Günderrode operates with a system of sympathies and affinities. We'll come on to this too with the letters between two friends. Instead of the tension resulting from polarized forces, as we can find in Schelling, in Günderrode it is the force of attraction on an almost molecular level between the individuals that brings them back together in an erotic embrace in death, paradoxically in the moment of the body being vaporized. And I'll just give the quotation in English here. For now, the once divided flames of love come together ardently in a single flame. That's two lines from the poem. A further two lines, I quote, united are the separated elements. The end of existence becomes the pinnacle of life. The personal and material becomes fused in this idea of united are the separate elements to the point of depersonalization entirely. Elementa, elements, is a term for Günderrode that refers to matter in general. The idea of love is important to Günderrode and is often used as a universalizing or totalizing force. There's also the poem, for those who know Meliti, Überall Liebe, love everywhere. Well, the force of love as attraction is a universal constant, even in the afterlife in the underworld. So we have then a certain adaptation of Schelling's thought, but I'd just like to briefly bring back the idea of materialism by looking at Günderrode's notes on Schelling's Platonic dialogue, Bruno, or on the divine and natural principle of things, where she uses these notes as a springboard to overcome Cartesian dualism. She writes these notes in around 1804. This is when we have the most substantial interpretation and dealings with Schelling. So here I quote, the true idea of materialism was lost early on. In this manner, matter is the eternal one, and however it may become separated in appearances into what we call possibility and reality, form and essence, the finite and the infinite, body and spirit, repulsion and attraction, it does not contain these oppositions. Rather, these are its various manifestations. The organic body, however, the most perfect synthesis of form and essence, thought and being, spirit and body, is its closest imitation. This is very important, I would submit, for how we think about letters between two friends, for the idea of the earth. Here we have in Günderrode's notes on Schelling, which do cleave close to the original, an attempt to vitalize matter, with the concept of the organism as the epitome of a unity of apparently diametrically opposed concepts. The textual logic here reflects also a long-standing interest of Günderrode's in dual aspect monism. If we look back at her work from sort of 1802 to 1804, she's very interested in the idea of dual aspect monism, trying to find ways in which body and mind can be monistic. The image of the organic body as the highest synthesis of form and being, however, offers a naturalist variant of Günderrode's previous work, a point to which I can only allude to here, but am happy to expand upon. This spiritualized understanding of matter offers, I submit, a redeemed form of materialism. And here I'd like to come on to discuss these letters between two friends. This understanding of, I would say, spiritualized materialism as pantheism is also important for this text from Meliti. Letters between two friends, Briefe zweier Freunde, is a variant on the Socratic dialogue, proceeding from a sonnet to a partly fragmented epistolary correspondence, and the unnamed junior speaker takes precedence over Eusebio, the Blessed One, is the meaning of the Greek, whom is approached with reverence. The unnamed speaker, we are told in the first letter, suffers from despair and hopelessness that is a form of creative blockage. But these are but paroxysms of a latent spiritual crisis. And the reason why I mentioned this here is because the Idee der Erde we have is really the final part of these letters, the final letter that we have. If we look at the published version, as it were, in the letters between two friends, it's very clear that the crisis that comes about that is then resolved at the end of the text is also one to do with poetic creativity. So this is very interesting intermingling of poetic concerns with spiritual and also philosophical concerns. The unnamed speaker in the first letter that we have approaches Eusebio as a child would a high priest, where the language of friendship assumes a religious dimension by analogy. Whilst Günderrode may have taken some inspiration for this text from Schiller's early Philosophische Briefe, his philosophical letters, in both cases, a crisis is caused by the destructive potential of skepticism, and the metaphysical narratives are inflected with the Platonic vocabulary of perfection. Such a parallel may overlook the significance of the status of poetry for the text itself. In the first letter, the unnamed speaker diagnoses the ills of the present age, and their creative blockage is also about the dearth of inspiration for themselves as a poet. This is sort of an idea of being modern and somehow lacking the inspiration that was there present for the ancients. How to cure this blockage involves returning to first principles. It's really a philosophical solution of how the individual is metaphysically grounded in the world, and that serves as a means to quell the speaker's initial torment and lament. And I'd like to then proceed by looking in detail at the speaker's then solution to their problem in the third and final letter. This takes the form of a consolation narrative, where the speaker's confrontation with death gives rise to a revelation. I quote, "Then suddenly everything became clear to me in a revelation and will reign eternally so," end quote. This forms the poetic inspiration for the eschatological theory that follows. What we have here in the letters between two friends is a salvation history framed in terms inspired by Schelling, but it is one that, more importantly, also makes recourse to an idea of perfectibility, which I can very happy to expand on too. This eschatological cosmology functions as a means to find a cure, and that cure is found in the act of creativity itself, in creating and giving expression to a new master narrative, a new non-Christian salvation history that acts as a self-cure. The speaker rediscovers enthusiasm through the experience of a profound revelation, and so resolves the blockage that was so concerning in the first letter. In what follows, the poetic, philosophical, and sacred are entwined. I think when we come to Günderrode's philosophical text, we can't help but look at the religious resonances that and the vocabulary that's used. What the same unnamed speaker formulates in the final letter is then an eschatological theory tinged with vocabulary that might be familiar from Naturphilosophie, where Günderrode, as we find in the poem that I mentioned, focuses not on polarities that we find in Schelling, but instead on the affinities and sympathies within elements of matter. And I have here a very, very long quotation, but please bear with me. I quote, "To be sure, I know that life is just the product of the most intimate contact and attraction between elements. I know that its blossoms and leaves, which we call thoughts and sensations, have to wilt when this contact ceases, and that the individual life is given over to the dictate of mortality. But as certain as I am of this, I have no doubt about another point, the immortality of life as a whole. For this whole is life, and it surges upward and downward in its limbs, the elements, and whatever it may be that dissolves, the process that we otherwise call death, and so returns to the original elements. It mixes with these according to the laws of affinity, that is, like attracts alike. But these elements have become different after having once been compelled into life in the organism. They have become more alive, just as two who have practiced a long fight are stronger at its end than at the beginning. So too are the elements, for they are alive, and each living force strengthens itself through practice. When they return to the earth in this way, they augment the life of the earth. The earth then gives birth to the stuff of life that have been returned to it once more in other manifestations, until everything that has the capacity for life within the earth becomes alive through ever new transfigurations." So just to sort of pass this passage here, each individual life contributes to the teleological development of the whole. Here it's given as the life of the earth. It could be the life of the universe. It could be the life of the cosmos. There's some sort of steppage of what that means. It's very interesting here that it is used, the term the life of the earth is used. And what this means in this development is that all matter eventually becomes alive and organic. For Günderrode, there appears to be a slippage in meaning between what is alive and what is organic. Both are positively connoted, meaning that which is alive and dynamic. These two words mean quite different things now, and they would have meant quite different things also, I think, in the proto-biological thought that we can find in the period. In this quotation, death is not framed as an endpoint. Rather, it is understood with a nod to chemistry, and this would go back to Günderrode's studies of shelling and also chemistry, as being about the composition of matter. Therefore, death is a transition, a threshold to the future, more perfect form of being. And here I will have to abandon this very long and interesting quotation and come on to some further quotations. Starting with the first one here on the slide, I quote, "The individual lives eternally on in the all, whose life it develops through its individual life, and after its death, even heightens and augments it, and so, through life and death, helps to realize the idea of the earth. The individual gains, in this way, the emotional consolation that its life and death contribute to the self-realization of the world, which is itself an indirect form of immortality." What is meant here by self-realization? Here, Günderrode makes recourse to a concept of perfectibility, one that features elsewhere in her literary and metaphysical texts. Perfectibility doesn't necessarily have to be positively connoted. It's in Rousseau, it tends to be much more, for example, negatively connoted in terms of the philosophy of history, too, in terms of the progression of societies. And Friedrich Schlegel and others in the early Romantic circle pick up on this notion of perfectibility as something that is sort of polysemic in the sense that it can be either positively connoted or negatively connoted. For Günderrode, I think the concept is useful, not least because she actually uses the term, precisely because it allows this sort of slippage between optimistic renderings and also pessimistic renderings. Here, however, the self-realization of the world is couched in terms of harmony and perfection. The endpoint of this process of perfectibility is the creation of the transfigured divine body, an embodiment of perfection where mind and body interpenetrate to the extent that they are identical. This divine body is distinguished from conventional understandings of flawed matter. And here I think we can, in the second quotation on the slide, see resonances with Günderrode's study of Schelling's Bruno. So the quotation here, "a truly transfigured body without flaw or disease and eternal." What is the appeal of these metaphysical speculations? Günderrode is a very interesting author and philosopher precisely because there's a clear tendency in her work towards making these metaphysical statements. Günderrode combines two narratives in Briefe zweier Freunde, and that is Between Two Friends. It's an amalgamation of a linear teleology of eschatological perfection and with that of the cyclical account of birth as a fall and return. It's a variant of the idea of Neoplatonist emanation. Vitally, however, this vision of perfection is repeatedly cast in doubt, if not eternally deferred. And that's why I think the use of the term perfectibility is useful, because it allows us to have a telos that may never be completed, might be hoped for. We might also lament the fact that we hope for it. And I think in the context of this text, it's more than a gesture of humility on the part of the speaker that we have here. It also has implications for the salvation narrative that the text upholds. There is an esoteric aspect to Günderrode's interpretation of living nature as pantheistic. This soteriological narrative hinges on the idea that nature, and therefore God, suffers for and from the lack of its perfection that has become manifest in the universe. If the divine is within every individual, then salvation history has been radically reformulated in an egalitarian mode. In this monist conception of the universe, to return to the sort of religious resonances here, Christ is not needed to descend to mankind as a savior, but rather the individual participates in the divine and is responsible for nature's salvation by realizing its perfection. That is, eternal life, a state that would eliminate death entirely. What this does is present, if for those who know Günderrode's work, a modified argument from earlier metaphysical texts by her, such as an apocalyptic fragment, such as Story of a Brahmin. In Letters Between Two Friends, individuality is no more than a precursor towards a higher state of being in an enlivened cosmos. This is a very important distinction to make. That individuality becomes something that's subordinate to a higher state of being. In earlier texts, Günderrode is very much concerned with the idea of how do you have the concept of the individual and how do you have the concept of a metaphysical whole and allow space for self-development that contributes to an absolute reciprocity between them, that is not therefore put in this hierarchical mode that we can see in Letters Between Two Friends, which reformulates a problem of individuation, which is a perennial concern of Günderrode's, because what is concerned in what the concern that we have in Letters Between Two Friends is the desire for, in a Neoplatonist sense, a state of kenosis, of perfect simplicity for with the divine. That means that we lose the concept of the individual entirely. We can't somehow hold on to that. And there's another reference in Letters Between Two Friends, where it's very clear that there's a Manichaean concept of the individual, that we fall into individuality, and that itself is a sinful state that we have to somehow overcome through the narrative of Neoplatonist emanationism. So the perfect state of simplicity then, or perfection, would be this sense of, therefore, emanation back to the divine. But this hoped for state of perfection remains in the text necessarily utopian. It remains unobtainable. And this is emphasized then at the very end of the text. And I've got the quotation here as the last one on the slide. I quote, "The God of the earth laments that his blessed divine life is still distant." We have no mention prior to this of the God of the earth. This is simply a sort of metaphorical move by Günderrode here, but it's interesting then that we have this reciprocity formulated in a different way. What we have then with this moment is the idea of apokatastasis, the restitution and salvation of all things in the form of the perfect divine body. It's one that's nonetheless held on to, even though it may never be realized. I'd like to suggest that there's an appeal nonetheless to this soteriological narrative, and that lies in the dynamism, that lies in the fact that this perfection is hoped for but is ever deferred. This fascination also with vital animation that we have through these theories of matter owes a debt to late 18th century scientific and biological theories of the generation of life as well. It's not just the sort of heritage from Schelling, it's also generally to do with an idea of das Leben being an important factor for Günderrode. In fact, it's the most consistent semantic object across Günderrode's work. Walter Morgenthaler, who produced the critical edition of Günderrode's work, did a statistical analysis, and Leben, life, is the most important concept for Günderrode, or is the most important word for Günderrode, and it always therefore becomes a concept that's being worked through in different ways. So dynamism, therefore, is important in this narrative, and any endpoint to this dynamism would therefore amount to its dissolution. So the text almost needs to frustrate its own narrative to sustain itself. What this means, therefore, is that there is a tension between the two narratives that Günderrode is upholding in this text, between the progressive, perfective cycle of productivity and the henosis itself, that perfect simplicity with the divine. That would amount to stasis, to the dissolution not just of the individual, but of the entirety of imperfect, phenomenal reality. So for this reason, I find this text very compelling too. The appeal of this narrative, I would like to suggest, lies nonetheless in a certain expression of hope for all the lament that we have in the final quotation on the slide here. And it is one that crafts a reciprocal or dialectical relationship between the individual and divinized nature, even if the individual becomes subordinate. What it does is it writes the individual back into nature and nature into the individual. The individual's worth is purely relational in how it contributes to the teleological development of the cosmos. That is something that I think is an important move, the individual's worth being purely relational, that it doesn't have worth in and of itself. Günderrode pursues the thought of the primacy of nature also in this text to the point of removing the human element altogether, and with that its distinctiveness, ethical or otherwise. It's not concerned with human society. It's not concerned with concepts of Menschheit or Menschen. And this is something that we can find not only in Letters Between Two Friends, in Briefe zweier Freunde, but also in Melite as a whole. They depend on a naturalist fallacy, on deriving norms from nature. But there's a certain advantage to this move. It allows what this conceptual move allows for the nullifying of the sting of materialism by absorbing it into a sort of certain pantheist, spinozistic, Schelinian pantheist conception of the universe. And it points, therefore, to its overarching function as an alternative to Christian models of salvation. So how might Günderrode, I suppose, be viewed in her time to come out from looking at this text in particular for a moment? I mentioned very briefly earlier in the paper that Günderrode is more radically Spinozist in her metaphysical commitments to pantheism than her contemporaries such as Novalis and Hölderlin. I'd just like to give a few examples of this here. For example, we could think about the narrative structure of Novalis's unfinished novel, Heinrich von Ofterdingen, Henry of Ofterdingen. That corresponds in some ways to the cyclical and linear structure of perfectibility and the philosophy of history that we can find in Günderrode. But what is fundamentally lacking in Novalis, by comparison, is the framework of Spinozism and the spiritualization of matter that informs Günderrode's metaphysics here. Much as we know that Novalis was interested in Spinozist and Spinozan thought, and he plays that often as sort of Fichte versus Spinoza in his very stimulating notes. What Novalis also does that's different from Günderrode is that he holds on to a concept of God that is separate from nature or distinct from nature. Günderrode's position is in Melite altogether more naturalist by collapsing the divine into nature entirely. Hence how we have the God of the earth, der Gott der Erde, but we also have other examples of texts where we could think about this point in too. So Novalis, I think, is close to Günderrode, but also distinct. He doesn't push the idea of collapsing the divine into nature entirely as much as Günderrode does. And equally, Hölderlin is attracted to the vocabulary of Neoplatonism and Platonism that Günderrode uses in her metaphysics. He strays towards Spinocism in his novel Hyperion, as well as his play, and an unfinished play, The Death of Empedocles. I would argue, and I would be happy to extend upon this further, that Günderrode is pursuing pantheism with a remarkable consistency that really is unparalleled if we compare her to Novalis and Hölderlin. There are other figures we could think about too in this context. We could think about beyond romanticism and think about Goethe's very famous reception of Spinozist thought too. She also draws on a series of eclectic sources too in order to pursue her metaphysics. She is also interested in non-Christian sources of revelation, looking at Zoroastrianism, looking also at Hinduism. I mentioned that very briefly in the context of the poem The Wives of Malabar. So I think when we're looking at Günderrode, one of the questions that concern me in my project on this is what will make her unique. And the main questions that Günderrode pursues in her metaphysical text, and as I hope to have shown with Letter Between Two Friends, would reflect at first glance what Dalia Nasser has classified as the central questions and concerns of philosophical romanticism: how mind and nature, how the one and many, how the infinite and finite relate to one another. Günderrode, I would submit, engages in a broader project of naturalization, in a project of poetic attempts to anchor the individual in the whole that has the effect of inoculating against the dangers of materialism, fatalism, and atheism, by transfiguring pantheism into a form of spiritualized materialism, by way of Schelling, by way of Herder's interpretation of Spinoza as well. And what this is responding to in Günderrode is something that I'd be happy to discuss as well. I didn't have scope for that in this paper. There is one tiny little text that is very helpful in this context. So this project of naturalization and the use of pantheism has the result that certain concepts such as teleology, individual agency, and self-development can be maintained. And these are configured in different ways across Günderrode. This process of naturalization is particularly evident in Melite, where Günderrode, as I've hoped to have shown, partly drawing on Schelling, takes pantheism to its sort of logical endpoint, where everything becomes part of the subjectivity of nature. Humans and nature are no longer distinct orders of being, and how this is played out also poetically is quite radical, actually, in the collection, and that's a literary historical point, which I didn't have time to touch on here. This has an additional effect. As I mentioned, the individuation can be perceived as sinful, meaning that the loss of individuality and singularity is therefore in Medliete and also in Letters Between Two Friends to be welcomed. And this is the point that I've always found intriguing about Günderrode, that we push this project of naturalization so far that we want to hold on to an idea of the individual, but actually the loss of individuality and singularity is indeed to be welcomed in Medliete. I'm very happy to discuss this further, and I think that is probably it from me. Thank you ever so much for your attention.
Thank you, Joanna, very much for this wonderful talk. I think many of us learn a lot. Now I'll give the floor to Christine for the response.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Good. Thanks so much, Joanna. That was amazing. I really enjoyed revisiting your work. I read the book when it came out, and I was excited to reread parts of it again in order to prepare for my comments here. So I thought I would do a little bit of contextualization, not much, just a tiny little bit, and then I have 5 clusters of questions, and you can focus on 1 or 2, or you can respond to all of them depending on what you feel like. I wanted to say a little bit first on the form of your project, because coming from philosophy, but being somebody who, I mean, you said you dabbled in philosophy. I don't think you dabble. I think you're doing philosophy, but I'm kind of moving in the other direction. I'm moving from philosophy, often straying into poetry and drama. And I'm really fascinated throughout your book, reading your book, by the way in which you take both philosophy and poetry seriously. I mean, it's important to do that, of course, if you want to read and engage Günderrode, but so easily we end up being a little bit provincial and focusing only on her philosophy or on her poetry. I mean, I think it's especially fascinating how you emphasize that philosophy in her work manifests itself in a poetic form, or as you sometimes say, I think, in a poetic practice. And you do this, I mean, you work within this tension or synergy between philosophy and poetry, and you're still doing this with philosophical rigor and poetic sensitivity. And that is just fantastic. Now, I've been teaching Günderrode for quite some time, 6, 7 years, and I do it typically twice a year in 2 different contexts. And it's fantastic that we have the works in Anne Ezekiel's translation, but what I've really, really missed is good secondary literature. Whenever we're doing historical work with our students, we're giving them insights into the historical texts, but we're also teaching them to become good scholars. And your book, I think, and your talk here today will just exemplify in such a good way how that can be done. So thanks so much for that. When it comes to the larger scope of the book, you're very clear that you want to get away from Günderrode's biography. In the Günderrode literature, there is an obsession almost with her life, with her tragic fate. And this goes not only for Günderrode, but for all women philosophers. It seems to be the rule rather than an exception. If you were a woman philosopher, you had a really, really exciting life. You were not spending time in academia, so because you were excluded, you got to live. And in Günderrode's case, this has really harmed the scholarship. And moving away from her biography, you emphasize in a very exemplary way her contributions to philosophy, her republicanism, which you didn't talk about today. I'm curious to hear you say more about that. her view on perfection and perfectibility, and her pantheism, which of course was the focus of today's presentation. So you define the Pantheismus-Streit or Pantheismus in general as the thought that God and nature are one. And Günderrode, by being situated with respect to this pantheismus debate, is placed in the midst of the philosophical debate of the early 19th century, communicating in her work with practically all the philosophers at the time, with Herder, with Schleiermacher, Schelling, Fichte, and so on and so forth. It's also interesting to look at the Pantheismus side in the way you do, because your reading, I think, emphasizes how the debate about pantheism, following in the debates about materialism, is to some extent an existential debate, almost like a proto-existentialist debate. It is a question about the meaning of a human life and the meaning of human life as such. You didn't talk much about that in this particular talk, but I think it is something that comes out of your work on Günderrode and Spinoza. So with this larger background in mind, I want to turn to my questions or clusters of questions. I really thought one of the interesting subtexts of your talk was the topic of perfectibility, which you return to over and over again, but don't really expand on. So I would love to hear you say a little bit more about perfectibility and how, if at all, this plays in to Günderrode's late work, not just the early work. And one of the things that I'm interested in here, given how you set up the argument of your talk, is to what extent the turn to perfectibility can help us solve or respond to this larger problem of meaning or nihilism that that comes out of or is part of the pantheismus debate in Germany at the time. So I'd love to hear you say a bit more about this super important concept of self-perfection. The second topic that I wanted to address has to do with the way you place Günderrode in the philosophical landscape. You contrasted her really nicely with Hölderlin and Novalis, but you're also emphasizing how close she is to Herder, to Schleiermacher, to Schelling, and from my point of view, having worked on Herder and Schleiermacher as philosophers of interpretation, of culture, they're quite different from Schelling. And at times throughout your talk, I was kind of wanting to say, stop for a minute. How can we be close to both Herder and Schelling at the same time? With Schleiermacher, to me, Günderrode seems as closely related to Schleiermacher as she is to Schelling. His position is very different from Schelling's, and both Herder and Schleiermacher have sturdy philosophies of culture, which, at least towards the end of your talk, you seem to think that Günderrode, in her late writings, will abandon. So how does Günderrode position herself with respect to these thinkers, not just with respect to Schelling? Relatedly, a third problem area that I wanted to address. You talk about Günderrode's naturalist fallacy, that she derives norms from nature, that she almost reduces the individual to nature. And I wonder at times if you tone down her interest in culture. To some extent, she gets to this through Schelling, but she also gets to this through her interest in Hinduism, through her interest in Islam, and so on and so forth. So there seems to me to be a really interesting double movement in Günderrode's work, where one is towards pantheism, and then there is another movement that maintains, at least at some level, an interest in culture and not just in this juxtaposition that you sketched here between individual and nature, and then individual being dissolved in nature towards the end of her work. My fourth question is straightforward, and I want to hear how you define or think we can define with Günderrode the notion of die Erde, of Earth. It's a really tricky notion to deal with. I keep thinking that it's different from, let's say, Schleiermacher's notion of the universe, which encompasses all there is. I think it is closer to Henrik Steffens, who's somebody you did not mention, but I think he's present in your work. And Steffens, I'm speaking from Norway, so I have to mention him. He's the only Norwegian philosopher we have. But he's interesting because he has a notion of the earth. And the earth for him has a history. So the earth is not pure materialism. The earth develops. The earth changes. A mountain will change form, etc. So that even the material world, the non-organic world, comes with a history. It's not an organism, or maybe the earth is, but you can talk about a stone, for example, and it has a history. So I'm wondering if you can say a bit more about this really central notion of the earth and how it is related to the idea of life. And then my final area of interest was the references to Platonism, Neoplatonism. They were scattered throughout your talk. For me, Platonism, possibly Neoplatonism, also, it's not just a position, it's not just a metaphysics, it's also a certain commitment to a way of doing philosophy. And I would love to hear you say a bit more about how you see Günderrode positioning herself as a philosopher. What is her idea of philosophy? How does she want to philosophize? And I assume this is something you must have thought a lot about, since you position her as you do productively in the intersection between philosophy on the one hand and poetry on the other. All right, those were some points that we can start with, I guess, in the discussion.
Goodness. Thank you ever so much for that, Kristin. I now have a furious number of notes that I must now find some way to sort of coalesce into something vaguely coherent. So I think what I'll do is I won't necessarily go through in sort of I'll try and go through in order some way or other. So on the sort of question on sort of meaning of the human life and sort of ideas of perfectibility and this narrative that sort of comes out. And I think you also interestingly use the term self-perfection there, which is distinct and an interesting distinction to make too. I think so that if you want to sort of look at the sort of the genealogy for Günderrode, the ideas of perfectibility come out of the sort of thinking about the philosophy of history, and that will be linked up with her texts that are concerned with republicanism as well, which are informed by a sort of sense of historical lament, trying to find ways in which to uphold republican ideals in the sort of post 1793, 1794 period as well. So perfectibility is a useful concept then, because to sort of hold up and to reformulate when you've seen a sort of historical disaster emerge with the sort of dashing of republican ideals. So her texts on Brutus, on the murder of Caesar, are important in this context. But I think the idea of self-perfection is different from that. In the sense that seems to be much more, you could take a sort of Schillerian heritage to this, thinking about ideas of developing your own faculties. That's much more humanist in sort of its derivation. I sort of noted down Fichte as well, which is always a dangerous thought for me, because I'm by no means a Fichtean person, but she does actually write notes distinguishing between perfection and perfectibility via Fichte. That's how she's thinking that through. So I probably try to sort of hold perfectibility away from ideas of or just distinct from self-perfection, because that self-perfection seems much more than rooted in debates to do with Bildung too, in around the turn of the 19th century. And on the sort of the self-questioning, the meaning of a human life and how sort of pantheism is to do with that, what comes to mind is then to do with the sort of the framing of some of the other poems and also prose texts that are concerned with pantheism, which are very much from the perspective, say, an apocalyptisches Fragment, an apocalyptic fragment, or once a dulcet life was mine, once a sweet life was mine, einstens liebte ich süßes Leben, about a sort of self-questioning and trying to find one's not to one can find meaning for oneself in the human life is to find some sort of metaphysical orientation. And I think that would be that finding some sort of metaphysical orientation would allow me, I hope, to link onto the Platonism versus Neoplatonism question, where the Platonism comes in is often not so much, I think, to do with the way of doing philosophy, but the reception of certain ideas, of certain sort of Platonist ideas that we can see. I mean, the Platonist ideas such as eros and anamnesis are very prevalent in the period. If we think about Moses Mendelssohn's work, for example, and I have to confess, I keep on seeing sort of Platonist poetry as well in the period that reworks certain ideas. So I'm not sure, please do correct me if Günderrode so much has a commitment to a Platonist way of doing philosophy, but there certainly are ways in which Platonist ideas can be seen as manifesting in her works as dynamics in an apocalyptic fragment, that you have to have the remembering of your sort of pre-conscious state and the desire to somehow return to that. And then that can be wrapped up in a certain narrative of emanationism too. So that would be I would say maybe it's not a way of doing philosophy, but the way of doing philosophy, I think the only answer I have in a sort of purely practical and social sense, it is a social one. It's a social practice with other women, and as well with other men. So on the purely the historical level, it is collaborative. We can see that if we look at the manuscripts. So Günderrode's sort of later studies are often done in conjunction with Susanna van Heyden. And as well as she's receiving sort of impulses from the men that she's writing to as well. So there's very much a sense of the sort of dialogue as being then important in the practice of doing philosophy. Whether she, I mean, this is the point where I find myself at the limits of what I can say. How she thinks about ways of doing philosophy. I think the only other answer is I think there's quite a distinct eclecticism that's going on. There's a sort of distinct eclecticism about trying to find as many sources as possible from what perhaps we'd now call world religions, and then linking back potentially via sort of Heidelberg scholarly circles towards the sense of there's been some sort of original divine revelation and that somehow manifests in various ways. That would also be a Hederian point too, but the sort of Heidelberg circle of Friedrich Kreutzer and Kai Darp were also thinking along those lines. That may not satisfy, that may not be a satisfactory answer, Christopher, which I must apologize, but I will try now to think about then Steffens, whom, yes, you're absolutely right, I do give Steffens a name check, and it's a rather paltry name check, so I have to make up for that. Certainly. I've always found the idea of the Earth a really intriguing feature of the letters between two friends. Because as far as I'm aware, that Günderrode is not primarily interested in concepts of the Earth in the rest of her work at all. It's really something that comes up in Melite as to do with the interaction between natural forces. There are two sort of partner poems on the Nile and Egypt where the Earth gets thematized as this barren space. In the context of letters between two friends, it seems to be Briefe zwei Freunde. It seems partly to be a sort of regulative idea. I can only think that it's being posited as the endpoint of the narrative. But I think I'm also sort of tempted to agree with you that it's not sort of maybe potentially maybe empirically inflected or scientifically inflected in the way that you would find with Steffens, but it's also something that is mutable as well. I think there's space for some sort of mutability there. But I've always struggled with that idea and somewhat dodged the question, I have to say, by sort of saying, well, is this just Erde not being used to mean specifically Erde, but is it a stand-in for other endpoints of metaphysical narratives that we can find throughout Günderrode? But I'm very happy to draw on this point further, because those who really have spent a lot of time with the idea of the Earth will be able to tell me a lot more about it. I'm absolutely certain. Okay, right. I will hold the Schleiermacher, Schelling, and Fichte and Herder question last, because but I will then, I think I want to come back to this idea of culture and nature that you refer to. And I think I stand here very much exposed. You're absolutely right. I mean, this is also to do with the mediation of notions of nature through culture. This is what we can find throughout Melite. It's referring to ritual practices that we can see, say, in there's a completely wonderful poem about the funeral rites of the Adonis. Which is all to do with ancient practices that are supposed to reveal no metaphysical truths, but these are practices, these are culturally grounded practices. We can see that the same with the sort of a Persian tale as well, using Zoroastrianism in order to talk about a sort of idea of polarity, really. So it's not sort of I think culture then has a mediating function, if anything, within that. And I potentially therefore, and this is also, I think, mentioned in the second letter that we have in the letters between two friends, that Eusebio talks about the Hinduism, sort of ideas of transmigration of the soul, that sort of thing is being extremely important. So there's a sort of syncretistic aspect to cultural mediation that's being played out in various ways, particularly in Melite, I would say. And Muhammad was mentioned earlier as well, this the longest of Günderrode's works, the play, which is also interested in this idea of cultural mediation of divine truths and how do you give expression to ineffable truths as well, to a new religion. That's a fascinating play for that reason. So that would, I hope that would adequately cover this sort of double movement that you described, Kristen. And on the very, I think, tricky point of Schleiermacher, this sort of constellation of Schleiermacher, Herder, and Günderrode, yes, they're very different figures. Absolutely, they're very different figures. I am not convinced that Günderrode is interested in Günderrode is interested in Herder for his Ideen. and she's interested in that for the sort of the sort of history of cultures within that. But I think what she takes from that is not so much the sort of philosophy of culture as the metaphysics from the idiom. So although she writes specifically about the sort of consolation that can be found in that text for her as an individual through looking at world cultures, my argument would be I think she's lifting the metaphysical ideas from Herder. With Schleiermacher, that's a really tricky question, and this is going to be slightly off the top of my head. Now, with Schleiermacher, I've struggled with this question. What is she getting from Schleiermacher? She reads the speeches, she reads the monologues, she makes notes on them. We have the notes. This is different from with Herder, where we don't have the notes at all. And clearly, she's closely engaging with the speeches in particular and is reinterpreting them. And I believe a Chilean colleague has written specifically interpretation of both of those works, whose name is escaping me right now, but that is essentially then an account of the interpretation of Schleiermacher by Günderrode. I would say that probably what would be the attraction of Schleiermacher for Günderrode are the sort of Platonic aspects of his argument. I mean, we do have clear indications that she's being told to read Schleiermacher's translation of Plato that's being published from, I think it's 1804 onwards. So that would be where Schleiermacher comes in. I think the way we have to think about one of the ways we can think about Günderrode is just how she almost, one could say shamelessly, is picking up on lots of elements that are present in a lot of different writers. And one of the questions, if I can throw this into the room, is I've never known what to do with Günderrode and Fichte. I've always thought that Fichte is, and I know that there are others who think that Fichte is extremely important for Günderrode, but I've never known how to position her with Fichte at all. I've always seen a bit of a sort of pantheist edge to the notes on the Bestimmung des Menschen, but I'm not sure they're consistently there. So what she gets out of Fichte's philosophy for me is still something of a mystery. But I think it's eclecticism again. It's going to be my sort of syncretism and eclecticism are essentially my answers, Kristen. I hope that covers most of it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Joanna, for your reply. Kristen, do you want to add something else, or?
No, thanks. I think this was helpful. Just the one thing I would add is that I would see Schleiermacher and his work on Plato as also emphasizing the dialogical aspects of Plato and Socrates. And for me, the dialogical aspect of Günderrode's own work is also super important, including, of course, the correspondence between the two friends, which has the form of a dialogue. And I would assume that what it meant to do dialogue in a Platonic way in this period in Germany was mediated through Schleiermacher to some extent.
Yes. I think they're sort of the first. I think those texts are interesting, aren't they? I think the reason that's completely right, and I'm most embarrassed that they didn't come to mind at all. There's also then we have these. I mean, I'm thinking about sort of Lessing's. Lessing is not necessarily considered strictly a philosopher, but he writes also these dialogical texts. I think about Ernst und Feig. Gott einige Gespräche. Those conversations are also dialogic. So for me, then the question is, how do we sort of think about this form? If there's a uniqueness to Günderrode's use of the form, it's to do with the fact that the pupil always exceeds the teacher, that they always manage to sort of almost browbeat the teacher into submission, as it were, rhetorically speaking, that they're the ones who, there's a really interesting way in which that interactive communication works. I'm thinking of the Manes, the Mains, the Dimanen, as an earlier sort of dialogic text by Günderrode too, but it's not sort of consistently so. I think that's why it's interesting that Idee outer, the idea of the earth exists as a the manuscript is simply the single, part, the draft version of the third letter. So compositionally, there's something going on here about how do we do philosophy? Do we do it through the form of the poem that can allow us access to unconscious aspects of the self, as we see with Once a Dulcet Life Was Mine? Do we do it in the form of oracular language that with the apocalyptic fragment, clearly it has it's written in the form of biblical verses, and if you look at the manuscript, the biblical verses have only been added in later on. It wasn't originally written like that. So I think there's a sort of experimentation with form as well that is also informed by sort of these other models too that might be slightly outside of what, I know, not the philosophy here, but slightly outside of what might be considered the regular form, or regular forms, I should say.
Thank you both of you for this very nice discussion between you. And now we can open the floor for questions, remarks, and comments. So please use the raise your hand function or just raise your actual hand and I will give you the floor. Anne Pollock?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we do.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. Joanna, thank you so much once again for this talk. That was really, really interesting. In terms of Spinozism, I mean, whenever it comes to any form of monism, I always have this problem. How do we get a manifold if everything is one and the same? Which, of course, there are answers to it. I'm aware of that. But when you mentioned the letters between these friends and that very last portion, I had a look into it and I found it really interesting that she kind of contrasts ways of behavior that go towards unity and other ways of behavior that kind of deter us from this kind of unity. So the good thing to do is to show love and virtue and to respect beauty and all of this. So that also sounds very Platonic, of course. And then slightly before that quote that you brought up, she says there are other things that if you commit to untruth and injustice and all of these things, then you move away from this unity. And I found it interesting that this seems to kind of mirror this tension that is between a Wanderers Niederfahrt and the apocalyptic fragment. Because the wanderer, he tries the same kind of thing, right? But he doesn't get there. And in that poem, I think his mistake, if I'm not mistaken in that, I think his mistake is that he doesn't quite understand what it means to really want to know something, but he wants to acquire something. So what would you say in her perspective? What is the mistake that the mistakes that human beings are making that deter them from kind of realizing this unity? That would be really, really interesting for me.
Goodness, what a huge question, Anna. Thank you so much. Yes, so there's Wanderers Niederfahrt. I mean, there's part of the problem is the fact that he's been born. I mean, that's the the fall into consciousness is the problem. But you're absolutely right. It also falls in line with a number of texts which are about what does it mean to have knowledge. Sort of texts that are in sort of have this sort of epistemological concern with them, and part of that has a Kantian heritage, but part of it is also simply a sort of, in some ways, quite an old-fashioned narrative about hubris. We could easily put sort of Goethe's Faust in this as a sort of immediate, or almost contemporaneous publication in this context. Is the desire to possess knowledge is itself the problem, and that's also to do with different sort of aspects of cognition as well, interested in what different sort of mental states that might allow us access to other things. So I think that might be a sort of slightly different, qualitatively distinct point from what we have in the section that I have. I should say I've guiltily ducked this section so many times because I've always read it as a very odd interpolation, that it's a text that is not concerned really with society. It's so much, at least this part of it isn't concerned with society, and then suddenly we get a series of norms that are being sort of interpolated towards the end, which are yes, as you say, absolutely Platonic. So I've got it up on the other side of my screen now, but it seems to be, I mean, there are a couple of things that seems to be the problem. One of which is so in terms of how do we, part of the lament that's in the first letter, and I think we can take this through in terms of sort of lack of unity, there's a criticism of Protestantism. There's a criticism of the democratizing aspects of Protestantism. That this is the problem of having, if we're going to go back to unity and manifold, it's too many manifold aspects. There's sort of the the sort of sectarianism that might emerge from Protestantism is seen as a way in which religion has been devalued in society. You could see this as being very close to the argument that Novalis makes in Christianity or Christendom or Europe, for example. So that certainly seems to be an issue that is brought up. It's never sort of elaborated on at all. Günderrode has this remarkable ability to sort of bring up ideas and then allow them to dissipate, as it were. It's, I mean, could I just throw the question to you? How do you interpret that section? Where we have beauty is the external expression of the sort of the balance of one achieves with oneself, or the balance one achieves with oneself. Love is the reconciliation, also in a sort of emotional religious sense of individual personality with the all, and virtue isn't really a concept that Günderrode makes much recourse to. This is probably why I ducked this section. Virtue of all kinds is then forgetting oneself, or forgetting the forgetting of oneself. Could be read then as a criticism of individualism, also a very strong form, sort of anatomized idea of individualism throughout. That's the only way I can read it. I don't know what your take is on it, Anna.
Well, when I read it, and in particular when you said that, well, here it seems that what she's saying is that a certain form of individualism is kind of a sin. So if we kind of reaffirm ourselves as these self-standing things, then what we are doing is actually that we are working against the idea of Earth. We are working against being an expression of the unity of everything, all of these kinds of things. So it seemed to me that this is something like her warning, that we have to understand these things. If we want to understand good things in an apt way, it can only be an understanding that is kind of taken into consideration what the whole needs from that, and not in any other way. And I haven't really paid attention to it before, and now it just struck me so much that the difference between these virtues and the vices is so clear in that regard, that it was just really interesting for me. And then I was clamoring to think about other instances where she makes these kinds of distinctions, and I couldn't think of it.
I think the only place that comes to mind is if we were to look at the study book again. I mean, again, there's the problem of mediation there, where we have a sort of series of notes. I think also under Tugend, that's the only time we would get anything about Spinoza's ethics is, I think, under Tugend in the study book. But then we have to think, okay, we have the grouping of the notes, but Kristen might have something much more to mind than I do.
Yeah, that's interesting. Cool.
Please, Christine, you want to say something? You are muted.
Sorry. One way to think about this dilemma that Anne is sketching here is via Schleiermacher. I mean, for Schleiermacher, the universe can only be realized if each individual, and he draws on Spinoza, but also Leibniz, if each individual develops themselves in the way they're meant to. So there is something incomplete about a universe where we haven't, each and every one of us, done our best to realize ourselves. And then you don't get this undivided all. The all is already complex.
Questions? I do have a question myself. Nice, a bit of a follow-up on what you were discussing. So, and it's regarding the somehow the practical aspect of Günderrode's pantheism, because I haven't read Günderrode yet, but from the passage you show, it seems to be a bit of a tension between the strong pantheistic horizon, and then the idea of perfectibility, if we understand perfectibility in a moral sense, right? How we can find the meaning of individual moral perfectibility with a strong pantheistic account of the universe, right? How we can conciliate these two things that are somehow, this is what the Spinozismus trite is about, right? How we conciliate individual freedom and the moral sense of individual freedom with a pantheistic account of the universe.
Yeah, yeah. Yes, no, I think that's absolutely right, and I think the sort of solution that yeah, because that's the sort of the pantheism controversy is interesting because there are various solutions that are proposed to this problem. So you have Mendelssohn's solution on the one hand, and I think if I'm going to sort of fly the flag for Herder again, I think the sort of the solution that Günderrode chimes with is that of sort of Herder, which is this idea of sort of global determinism, that we sort of can have our freedom, but we have to understand that we are completely determined at the same time. But in the understanding that we are completely determined, we also have our freedom. So it sort of tries to sort of do both, as it were, and it doesn't resolve this tension precisely because this narrative, this sort of, I suppose, this telos has to be there in some way or other. And this telos is also bound up with determinism. So Günderrode can't do without that narrative of determinism, but she also wants to hold on to ideas of freedom at the same time. And it then ends up in precisely the tension that you just described. So via Herder is the only, I'm sure there are other sources as well for that. But yes, the global determinism point is the important one there.
Would you call Herder a determinist, though, and not somebody who has an organic teleology? Sorry.
Sure. I'm specifically thinking about the sort of section in about einige Gespräche, which is talking about the enslavement of the individual. So that's what I would be referring to there. I wouldn't say how that then it's necessarily. I think that this is the problem. It's not Herder overall, but rather the sort of the use of particular concepts here. So I'm just trying to call up the section that I mean, because he's trying to sort of get out of Jacobi's idea. Yes, so this is the serfdom of the individual human will that is then important to Herder too. But I think I would agree overall if you look at the idiom. This is sort of the organic teleology is there for Herder, but specifically the idea of the serfdom of the human will is important then. This double, it's an odd sort of doubling that I think is a rather unsatisfactory conclusion that then sort of gets worked out in Günderrode.
Okay. Karin?
Yes, thanks for the paper and the discussion. I think I have a question, namely whether she ever was experiencing the problem of being considered atheistic, because the pantheism and the non-Christian eschatology and so on, they all go into the direction of a certain atheism, and which I think was not at all accepted at the time. And are there any texts or indications that she was aware of this, or tried to hold back, or was accused of being an atheist, that kind of thing?
Thank you ever so much. So the answer is sort of yes and no. The sort of accusation of atheism is often contingent on a certain level of public profile. Thinking of Fichte in this context, and simply Günderrode never had the public profile that would allow that sort of polemical use of the term atheist to be used. But I think certainly I don't see any reflection, like a sort of a reflective, I don't recall any reflective comments on this specifically, but clearly she's operating with a non-Christian notion of the divine, which ends up, could be, I think, interpreted as being atheistic. But to my knowledge, at least, there is no explicit use of that sort of discourse. Anna, I don't know. You're nodding. You may know. I just don't think there's anything there. But certainly, is going the sort of the thrust of the argument is going in that direction, as you say.
But so the pantheism was socially accepted at the time, as long as it did not go into the direction of explicit atheism.
I think so. If we look at the sort of the reinterpretation, so one of the sort of ironies of the pantheism controversy is that Jacobi drops this, is trying to talk about atheism and various sort of problems in philosophy in the period. It's trying to discredit the name of Spinoza, but it results in then this increased interest with Herder, with Goethe as well, and with the early Romantics. So Spinozism becomes sort of, use the German term, salonfähig. It becomes in a certain way acceptable, as long as you sort of find a way to frame it correctly. And certainly I don't think would necessarily be always coded as atheistic in potentially the way that maybe French materialism would have been coded as atheistic in the 18th century as well. So it managed to sort of, I think, be reformulated in a way that wasn't considered too much of a polemic object, or at least as far as I'm aware, the Spinocism of the time there wasn't sort of, ongoing debates about that being necessarily, reasons to argue against an individual's philosophical position, but I'm very happy to be corrected on this.
Thanks.
Yes.
Yes, yeah. Thank you so much, Joanna, and thank you also, Christine, for this fascinating exchange. I have kind of a version of the previous questions regarding individual freedom, but perhaps focus on another concept. I was wondering whether Günderrode has any reflections on the concept of evil, because I understand the argument that somehow perfectibility is possible if we understand and situate ourselves within this whole. And I think that in the idea of the earth, she has also this passage in which she defines individual virtues in relation to the struggles of the earth to achieve a certain identity with itself and so on. But I was just wondering whether there is a possibility, or she considers the possibility of an individual that radically detaches itself from the whole and does something that is perhaps really evil, and whether this would be possible for her. And yeah.
Okay, that's a really interesting question. I'm doing a quick sort of search through the Zemljiche Werke. So the critical edition is available online now, so you can actually search it for particular terminology. And I think, I'm not sure Günderrode has a concept of evil. I'm not convinced by that. I think that there's a concept of sinfulness and sinful actions, or actions that are misconceived. Not necessarily concepts of evil per se in the context that you're describing it, so in the sort of metaphysical narratives. I think the closest that we can come to that is the play on called Magic and Fate, in which the protagonist this is sort of the whole play is really about Spinoza's fatalism, and the idea that there is, if you just have a fatalistic conception of the universe, there you can evacuate concepts of moral responsibility. So the protagonist takes this as justification to do exactly what his inner impulses might be, which happens to be murder. And there's punished in the play, as it were, because it turns out he murders his half brother, worse than murdering another individual. But so that is the only sort of instance I can think of a sort of simple act that has a sort of philosophical justification. But that's the flip side of the sort of optimism that's usually framed, in which pantheism is framed. It's rather the sort of fatalistic variants that Corby was so worried about. And sort of short section that we were discussing in Briefe zwei Freunde is necessarily a concept of evil, but I'm not sure there's so much evil.
I think, Joanna, your connection is maybe a bit. Yes, it's a bit unstable, your connection. So
Oh my
maybe,
goodness, I'm sorry.
yeah, we lost the end of your answer, I think.
That's okay. I mean, can you hear me okay now? Is that okay? Sometimes the connection
Yes.
drops for a couple of
Yes.
seconds or so.
Yes,
Yeah.
now we can.
Okay. I thought that's a rather sort of disappointing answer. I think the only thing I'd like to add to that is the I think closest we have to any sort of concept of evil is the very end of the Briefe zwei Freunde, letters between two friends, that every act of untruth, injustice, and self-interestedness or selfishness are these very sort of schematically, these are referred to as acts that prevent then the blessed state of perfection of the universe. But what that precisely means is never elaborated upon, and I don't think there's much further consideration of that.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Okay. If there are no further questions, maybe we can conclude here, at least the formal part of the session. Please join me in thanking again Joanna and Christine for the paper and the discussion. It was really interesting, and I think we learned a lot. And I would like to invite you to the next session of the Leuven seminar this semester. Next session will be March 20 with the paper on Kant philosophy of religion. So you can find in the link that Luis just sent the titles for the upcoming sessions. Okay. Thank you again, Joanna and Christine, and of course we hope that we will see you again soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.